Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. We have an amazing guest for you this week. Before we introduce that individual, I want to introduce the Executive Director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, our co-host for this week's edition of the Tech Ed Podcast, given that we'll be talking a little bit about certifications and the value of third-party certifications to our military veterans. We wanted to invite Jim Wall, Executive Director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, to join us this morning. Jim, thank you so much for co-hosting.
Thanks for inviting me, Matt. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. And it's absolutely great to have you with us. Jim, I know you're going to enjoy our guest this morning. And I'm going to start with a brief story. And so about 10 years ago, I was serving as the Chief Executive Officer of a company called American Finishing Resources. And we were a supplier to some of America's more iconic companies, Oshkosh Corporation, John Deere, Chrysler, Mercury Marine, Toyota, General Motors, and so on. And a big customer of ours was also Harley Davidson. And one of the things that I loved to do was to get to know the senior leaders of our customers, their chief executives, their vice presidents of operations, their general managers. And so I reached out to one of our largest customers, Harley Davidson, and reached out to the general manager of their plant in Kansas City, Missouri, and just sent an email and said, hey, I would love to meet with you if you ever had an opportunity. I get down to Kansas City quite frequently. If that would be a possibility, please let me know. Interestingly enough, not even 30 minutes later, I received an email back from that person, and they said they'd love to meet with me and to let them know when I was going to be visiting Kansas City the next time, and we'd set it up. And I made my way to Kansas City, best airport in the world, and made my way over to the plant. So while I'm driving to the plant, I'm thinking about what the day is going to look like. I'm going to walk into the building. I'm going to have to go through security. They'll usher me back to some waiting room. I'll sit there and wait. And then finally, when this person who's running this huge plant has time to squeeze me into their day, they'll invite me into their office. A couple things, Harley Davidson, great American company, huge flagpoles out in front of that building. So there's a gigantic American flagpole. There's a Harley Davidson flag. There's a flag for the state of Missouri. The other thing to know about Harley Davidson is, anytime you've got a company where your customers are willing to tattoo your logo on their arm, that you have a phenomenal brand. And that was true of Harley Davidson, just incredible following. And so these plants tended to attract a lot of tourists. I get to the parking lot, and of course, there's people milling around all over outside of the facility. And I'm walking by these gigantic flagpoles, and there's a gentleman standing there. He looks at me, and I figured him for a Harley Davidson tourist. And I looked him in the eye, and I smiled and said hello. And he said, Matt? And I looked at him, and I said, yes. And he put his hand out, and he said, John Lowry. And it was John Lowry, the general manager of that Harley Davidson plant. So here I am, one of probably, 500, 1,000 different suppliers to Harley Davidson. And John Lowry took the time not just to wait for me in his office, but to come all the way out to the front of this gigantic plant and greet me in the parking lot. And it was at that point in time I knew what a class act this person was. It was at that point in time, and I've learned over time how, in spite of all of his accomplishments, just a tremendously humble individual. It isn't really any surprise to me that he's risen to the level of Assistant Secretary of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Services for the U.S. Department of Labor. So, Secretary Lowry, thank you so much for joining us today on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Oh, thanks, Matt. You're bringing back great memories. And I'm glad we were able to welcome you in the plant, and appreciated all the great work you did for Harley when I was there and beyond. So thanks. No, it's great to join you.
Absolutely. And likewise, I certainly, my life has been touched in so many ways by knowing you. And I wanted to touch a little bit on your manufacturing career, Mr. Secretary. General Manager of Powertrain Operations, member of Harley Davidson Senior Leadership Group, then Chief Operating Officer for the Allied Recreation Group. You led Egon Zender's U.S. Supply Chain and Operations practice. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the world of manufacturing.
Sure. So I started with Harley. It was my first manufacturing role. I was a second shift shop floor supervisor in the transmission components area up there in Menominee Falls, and sort of worked my way up through factories. I stayed pretty much in operations leadership roles the whole time. Just went from, floor supervisor, area manager, director of operations, and so on and so forth, until I became a site general manager. And then I left Harley in 2013. And as you mentioned, went into the RV business and spent a couple of years there where I was not only responsible for manufacturing, and we had several plants, but also the engineering functions, design, product development, quality, human resources, logistics. So basically kind of everything but sales for that group of businesses. But manufacturing has always been sort of near and dear to me, and having had the privilege of sort of working my way up from the shop floor level, I think has given me a decent perspective, I think, on how manufacturing operations come together and when it works and why it works. That's been my journey in manufacturing, and certainly a real privilege.
So working your way up through that entire continuum certainly, gives you a great perspective in your current position. And I would also think enables you in really special ways to relate to some of the folks that you're serving today. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But in addition to your experience in the world of manufacturing, 15 years as a regular Marine Corps officer, 10 years in the Marine Corps Reserve, highly decorated, including being decorated for valor while leading a force reconnaissance platoon during Operation Desert Storm. So you had just a phenomenal career in the military prior to your time in manufacturing. Tell us about that and how it prepared you for your work in the manufacturing sector.
Sort of as you suggested, I had a similar experience in the military where I started off as a junior officer, platoon leader, and sort of worked my way up through various roles of increased responsibility. Also had a couple of staff assignments along the way that were interesting and kind of forward deployed, if you will. And I think these experiences prepared me for manufacturing just by helping me evolve as a leader. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was able to work with and for many superb leaders. And they helped me with my leadership journey, often by just setting the example. And, manufacturing tends to be a people-intensive endeavor, and it attracts workers from all sorts of backgrounds, as does the Marine Corps. And I think my military experience taught me how to get people from diverse backgrounds to work, effectively with one another. And another thing that the military experience, I think, helped with is just helped me manage stress and help me keep things in perspective. There's a lot of action that happens, more so than you want often in a manufacturing plant. And I think my military experiences, helped me evolve into the kind of person who's generally calm under pressure, or at least that's what I like to think about myself. And this is a skill I certainly picked up in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say in my time in manufacturing that you're always 30 seconds away from your next disaster. You never know when a line's going to go down. Right. You never know when you're going to have an order expedited, a personnel issue, whatever. When you're leading a manufacturing plant, you're on call 24/7. And you never know when something could go wrong that'll require you to jump right in. I really value your perspective on working with people from all kinds of backgrounds, especially in the day and age that we're in today, where diversity and equality are things that everybody should be working on. I was always impressed in manufacturing how it was one of the most diverse environments, probably the most diverse environment that I spent time in. And it really didn't matter, where you were from or who you were or what you looked like. There was a place for you in that space. And it's interesting to hear you harken back to your time in the military and draw some comparisons there. So very interesting observation. Switching now to the discussion about your current role and how your experiences set you up for that role. I want to take a look at something that was said by the U.S. Secretary of Labor, Eugene Scalia, upon your confirmation and being sworn into your current position as Assistant Secretary. And he said, and I quote, "As a Marine Corps veteran who's had a successful career in business, he understands how military service can lead to exceptional contributions in the private sector. John's conviction is that America's veterans, transitioning service members, and military spouses deserve every opportunity to succeed." I think that's just a great quote about your work at the Department of Labor, and just share with our audience, if you would, how your unique background set you up for your work today as Assistant Secretary of the Department of Labor.
I think certainly the manufacturing background and the military part of my careers are relevant. So many veterans are frankly tailor-made to go into sort of operations roles and manufacturing roles, and just having some insights into that world has helped me out. And you mentioned Egon Zehnder. I spent 4 years running the supply chain operations practice for the U.S. for that firm, and that executive search, it's leadership advisory, basically the human capital business. So that's been really really valuable too, because it's really given me some insights on what employers are looking for, when they hire. And then the other aspect I think of my career that's helpful in this role is one of the things in our portfolio is to investigate USERRA claims. So the USERRA is the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Act, and this is basically the piece of legislation that is meant to discourage employers from penalizing their people who get activated in the Guard or Reserve. And then when they come back, make sure that the job is there for them. And having been a reservist who was activated during my time at Harley-Davidson and deployed, and having been an employer who's employed plenty of reservists, all of these give me some insights into the various aspects of our portfolio. And I think probably finally, it's just having the privilege in my career to have led lots of different teams and lots of different diverse settings that always helps. At the end of the day, this is a leadership role. I know the importance, having worked for a lot of good leaders, of setting the vision, being clear on the priorities, and helping people kind of visualize what it is we're trying to do. And I'd like to think that I can bring all that to bear in this role as Assistant Secretary of Labor.
Yeah, I'm sure that experience just brings tremendous value there. So turning now to that role and the topic of training for veterans, I'll admit, when I first started thinking about your new role, and you and I got together earlier this spring, you had an opportunity to visit our tech center here in the state of Wisconsin. I thought about that role really being focused on veterans transitioning from military service to a, quote, job in the private sector. And you really took the time to set me straight on that. Certainly that's an important aspect, but there's so much more to it. So when we think about your mission, it's about the opportunity to enable veterans to have really rewarding careers and a rewarding life outside of military service for their entire career. And it's about their spouses, it's about their families. So maybe just a little bit on the overall scope of the work you do before we ask some more specific questions on the challenges veterans face when they enter the workforce.
Sure. We lump them into 4 buckets, the 4 Ps. Prepare is the first P. It's preparing people for that transition, both the military member who's leaving, but also that spouse, because they're going through a transition too. The second P is promote. So it's promoting veterans and advocating for veterans and helping employers understand the value that veterans bring. And I think this podcast is sort of an example of that kind of an activity. Third P is provide. So we provide employment services, both during the transition, but also throughout the life and the career of a veteran. We have homeless veteran reintegration programs. So people are homeless or on the path to homelessness, we provide employment services for them. We also fund staff in all the American Job Centers, and there's thousands of them across the country that provide employment services. And then finally, the last P is protect, and that was the protecting their well-earned rights under USERRA. But of all of that, I place the priority is we got to get the transition right. And to use a manufacturing analogy, it's kind of like that quality in station, right? As something moves through, station 2 and it has a perfect fit, form, function, everything's, up to spec. And then it goes down to station 3, that's not costing you anything. But if that passes through the station and there's a defect and you don't catch it in station 3 and it goes to the end of the line, or God forbid it gets to the customer, right? And you see how the cost of this thing goes up over time. So that's how I kind of think about the transition. If we get the transition right, then the compounding benefits of that, you can crank an extra degree or 2 of slope on someone's career trajectory right at the transition and help them hit that slope with a running start. Compounding benefits are conversely, if you get it wrong, the implications can last a lifetime. And so while we have a number of what I would call safety net type programs, my belief is if we really focus on the transition and we get the transition right for all our veterans, then we're going to have less homeless veterans down the road. So my manufacturing framework has actually been helpful to me in thinking about how do we put the priorities in the right spot to get the best outcome, not only for our veterans, but for the organizations that they go on to serve and for the country.
I love the analogy around manufacturing processes. And as a disciple of the book, The Goal, which I know you read and of Goldrat, it's really about kind of taking those bottlenecks out of that process and making sure that we take our PPMs in terms of quality all the way down to 0 by focusing on the process and making sure that we don't miss any of those important steps. Is that an analogy that works for you as well?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So speaking of some of those challenges and some of the bottlenecks in the process of bringing military veterans, transitioning them into the world of service after their military career, what are some of the bigger challenges that veterans face when they enter the workforce after service?
Sure. Let me just give some context here. So every year, there's nearly 200,000 service members who are taking off their uniform and transitioning into the civilian workforce. So this means that we have 200,000 opportunities to get the transition right or get the transition wrong. So the stakes are pretty high. Our vision is that we want all veterans to reach their full potential in the workplace. And unlike manufacturing, where you standardize the process and the idea is repeatability and get rid of all your variability, every one of these 200,000 people are different, right? So what it means for them to live up to their potential, it's going to be an individual thing, right? It's going to be based on what their ambitions are, what their values are, what their capabilities are, what their situations are. And so that is a challenge to try to get it right for every single person, because it's certainly not a one size fits all. I believe that the biggest challenge facing the veteran is they have to be able to answer that question, what do I want to do when I get out? And if you don't have a general idea what that might look like, then you're probably going to have a suboptimal transition. Helping the soon-to-be veteran in transition answer that question, what do I want to do? And then figuring out if there's a skills gap between here and there and how we might close that, and then finding the right path for that person to realize the ambition. That's probably the biggest challenge. And far too many transitioning service members, even despite the fact that we have a fairly robust transition assistance program for the last couple of decades, too many, in fact, the majority still really don't know what they want to do when they get out. And if we can make that number something like 20% as opposed to, I think it's 54% really don't know what they want to do, we'll make significant progress in my line.
So 54% not knowing exactly what they want to do when they get out, certainly great opportunity for improvement there. Helping them close the skills gap once they've identified what they want to do and making sure they have the requisite skills to be successful in that endeavor. Are there other things that the Department of Labor is doing to help match veterans with skilled careers?
I mentioned the transition assistance program. So this is something that it's a mandatory thing for people to go through before they leave active duty. And then we have an elective workshop for those that want to go down a vocational path, lots of different vocations, a manufacturing path or a skilled trades path. And we have several tools that can help match veterans to skilled careers, to include the Department of Defense's credentialing opportunities online, or the acronym is COOL, and they have another platform called MilGears. And what these online platforms do is they help match military training to industry recognized credentials and associated careers, right? So they try to look at someone's background to see, okay, if you were let's say a corpsman, for example, in the Navy, how does that relate to pursuing something, in an EMT? And are there gaps in your credentials that we have to close in order for you to get a recognized license in the civilian world? These tools utilize data provided by the Department of Labor's sponsored Occupational Information Network, OIN. It looks to find the shortest bridge between what they were doing in the military world to what they might do in the civilian world. Now, the challenge with this model is this: not everybody wants to do what they did in the military, right? In fact, many people don't want to do what they did in the military. And so for those people that are going to blaze an entirely, different trail, we need to find, a way to do that. And that's why I'm really excited about an upcoming pilot that we are in the process of launching right now. We're calling it the Employment Navigator and Partnership Pilot. And this is where we're going to be providing a one-on-one concierge, if you will, service to help that transitioning service member answer that question: what do I want to do after the military if it's not what I did in the military? And from there, that employment navigator is going to connect that service member to the right partner or a resource to begin that journey. We just want to be a resource to help that service member navigate this so-called sea of goodwill, which Admiral Mullen coined, and I think it's an apt metaphor. Help them navigate that, help them connect with the right program or the right service provider to help realize their ambitions. So we're kicking this off in next year. So we're in the planning phase now, but the services are very excited about it, and they've offered up 13 different locations, some in the U.S., some overseas, and then we're going to begin this thing in April 2021. So we're hiring these navigators as we speak.
And I know Jim Wall, our co-host today from the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, is busy taking notes as well, especially as Secretary Lowry referred to the COOL program and the importance of elected credentials. Jim, so I want to, on your behalf, ask a couple questions of the Secretary here. Our guest, by the way, is John Lowry, the Assistant Secretary of the United States Department of Labor. And Jim is putting together certifications around Industry 4.0. Now, Secretary Lowry, when you and I were together in manufacturing, we were kind of in an Industry 3.0 environment. I recall our conversation outside at a restaurant in Chicago, I want to say about 2 years ago when you were with Egon Zender, and we talked about Industry 4.0 technology and how it's certainly not a step transformation, but it's having a huge impact on the world of manufacturing. So Jim Wall, former executive director of the National Institute of Metalworking Skills, and today the executive director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, partnering with, again, many really recognizable manufacturing companies, including, by the way, Harley Davidson and others, Rockwell, Ashley Furniture, Boeing, Hershey's, to develop competencies and certifications around Industry 4.0 technology, so that as people are entering careers in manufacturing, as they're entering careers in Industry 4.0, they've got a base level, or in some cases an advanced level of understanding and certifications and credentials that show an employer the value of what they've learned. So do you see, and you've already referenced it a little bit, third-party credentials, are they appealing to veterans? Are they appealing to the Department of Labor? And would you see those as in Jim's work as a significant part of the solution to the puzzle here?
Yeah, absolutely. There's more and more interest in people seeking the credentials, not only for how well a credential can travel, but for obviously the intrinsic learning value of what you pick up as you obtain that credential. That's something that our service members are more and more interested in. We actually have an apprenticeship pilot going on 8 different bases, two Navy, 2 Marine Corps, 2 Army, and 2 Air Force, where we help vector service members into any one of the 20,000 registered apprenticeship programs that are in the Department of Labor's registered apprenticeship program database. And many of these obviously lead to journeyman's cards or some kind of a credential that can travel with that person for the rest of their lives. That kind of a model where you sort of earn while you learn, you're mixing classroom education with, on the job, and have a structured pathway to obtain some high level skill that obviously leads to a good and highly paid career. That's particularly attractive to military people because the military experience itself is sort of like that, right? It's part OJT, it's part classroom, it's structured, you earn while you learn. I think that's a really nice fit for advanced credentialing and apprenticeship credentialing for the military. Just culturally, it makes sense.
And I'm so glad, Mr. Secretary, that you mentioned the importance of apprenticeships. Jim Wall, I know that SACA, Smart Automation Certification Alliance, recently became a standards recognition entity for the U.S. Department of Labor's industry recognized apprenticeship program. So, Jim, maybe a moment or two on your experience. I know you had the opportunity to meet virtually with Secretary Scalia not too long ago when that announcement is made. So congratulations on becoming an IRAP, and maybe a moment or two on that process.
Well, thanks, Matt. Yeah, certainly. We are very excited about the new IRAP program. I think it's really going to move apprenticeships in a different direction, much more flexible, that industry groups can decide what is needed in a particular occupation and develop these industry recognized apprenticeship programs, which include some industry credentials, but in a really a little bit more flexible manner.
Yeah, we also are happy to and are vectoring service members into IRAPs too. So we also see the value of the industry registered apprenticeship or recognized apprenticeship programs too. So we're not just vectoring them into the RAPs, but to the IRAPs as well.
Yeah, I think one of the real advantages, especially for the veteran population, is many of these veterans have had years of training in various military occupations, and sometimes those occupations don't really directly correlate to occupations in the civilian workforce. But with the addition of some additional training to maybe fill the gaps between the training that they had in the military and what the current need is industry, that It could be done, I think, much faster with some veterans because of the experience that they have, and with the new IRAP programming having a lot more flexibility in terms of the minimum time requirements and so forth for an apprenticeship program. It could work out very nicely, and one example of that would be the apprenticeship program that Rockwell is running for veterans, and they're transitioning veterans in a matter of months versus years in a traditional apprenticeship program. Just building on that experience, on-the-job experience that they've had in the military, and really expediting the apprenticeship experience, and then moving them into really well-paying jobs in the civilian workforce. So I think those kinds of programs could be replicated in a lot of different occupational areas and in all different industry sectors as well.
I totally agree, Jim. And while I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of another really exceptional program. You condense the time and you allow people to hit their transition with a running start, and that's the Department of Defense's Skill Bridge program. And this is a program that allows transitioning service members to get valuable work experience and industry-specific training prior to them actually getting out. So it's only available to people that are within 180 days of the end of service, but within that window, they can start training, draw a paycheck, and often this leads to a job directly with that company who is providing the skill bridge training, or in the case where trade unions actually do have skill bridge programs where they're teaching a trade, and then that trade union is going to help find a connection for that transitioning service person, ideally in the location that they want to transition into. It's a program that does a lot of what you're talking about, Jim.
Lots of great opportunities for our nation's veterans to transition from military service to the world of civilian service. I want to turn our sights now a little bit to ongoing training. Mr. Secretary, bachelor's degree from Princeton University, master's degrees from Stanford, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. You are certainly no stranger to continuing education and to lifelong learning. As it relates to your perspective on behalf of our veterans and the Department of Labor, how can our four-year colleges and our universities, and for that matter, our community colleges, support your vision of our veterans achieving their full potential?
I think what the future holds for people that are just coming out of the military, after maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years, and have a long career in front of them, it's do two things. One, condition them to realize that people will probably have to reinvent themselves 3 or 4 times during the course of their working life, right? The world's becoming more disruptive, not less disruptive, more dynamic, not less dynamic. And so teaching them the importance of becoming lifelong learners, which, oh, by the way, I think a lot of military people are pretty adaptable to, because that's the sorts of experiences they have in their career experiences inside the military. You have a lot of pretty agile learners. So inspiring lifelong learning, letting them know that getting your degree, it's not going to be a one and done thing and you're kind of set for life. You're going to have to continue to pick up, whether it's other degrees or other credentials in your journey is going to be critical. The other thing I would recommend, this is very tactical, is if they don't have a student Veterans of America chapter at their university, but it's a wonderful organization and they should probably, connect with SVA. But this is a great sort of support network for veterans who are in higher education now, and does a number of things for them, not the least of which is sort of connecting to this, broader diaspora veterans out there that tend to be more than willing to help one another find excellent career opportunities.
Well, that sounds fantastic, Mr. Secretary. I want to share a quick story here, and I think I probably shared this with you before, but my experience as the volunteer coordinator for former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's veterans events at the Milwaukee County Zoo. So this goes back probably 10 years ago, is when we wrapped these up. But we used to have a huge event at the Milwaukee County Zoo, and we would draw 15,000 veterans and their families every year, and they would come to the zoo, and everything would be free. So the admission was free, the Zoomobile was free, the Sea Lion show was free. We served a huge picnic lunch to 15,000 people, which was no small feat in itself.
Wow.
And I was responsible for a number of years for recruiting all of the volunteers for this event. So it would take 150 to 200 people to put this on, people managing parking, people preparing food, serving food, providing directions, welcoming the veterans as they came to the zoo. It's just a phenomenal event. And here's the thing that amazed me year after year. And that was that the purpose of this was to say thank you, to say thank you for the service, for the sacrifices made by these great men and women and their families. And that was really what this was all about. And I can't tell you how many times at the end of the day, I would have families come up, say thank you to me, in some cases give me a hug, touching stories about people who had served in Vietnam and didn't feel welcomed when they came back from that experience, but now were being welcomed and thanked for their service at this amazing event. It just always struck me, Mr. Secretary, that these people had an event that the sole purpose was to show our appreciation to them. Their main goal was to make sure they appreciated and showed their appreciation to the people that volunteered and put this day on. So I just always found that humility incredibly amazing and incredibly unique. Veterans in so many ways are uniquely skilled to serve in a manufacturing environment, both in terms of their soft skills and their personalities, and in terms of their hard experience. How can employers best leverage the experiences of these individuals, both as they transition into the civilian workforce and ongoing as they continue their careers?
I totally agree with you that veterans make for wonderful employees. So I think the best thing they can do is realize the benefit of what a veteran brings to the organization. Veterans comprise, I think, one of the most capable and resilient talent pools in the nation. And just think about this for a second. So we have this all-volunteer force. We recruit primarily, out of the high schools, and only 29% of kids that are in high school today, seniors in high school today, are going to meet all of the standards for military service. So, whether that's mental, physical, moral, with respect to, getting in trouble with the law and using drugs and things like that, which are disqualifying. And only 29% would be even eligible to be considered for military service. And yet 67% of American high school graduates will enroll in college. Right. So, it's statistically, it's harder to get into the military than into most, not all certainly, but into most undergraduate institutions. So the raw materials, if you will, of the veteran, right, are pretty good. And then add to that this incredible experience that they have while they're in the military, where they're learning to work effectively in diverse teams, and they're accomplishing difficult missions under stressful conditions. They're gaining, hard skills, they're gaining soft skills. And they're in a culture, I think this is the most important thing, they're in a culture that encourages initiative, believes in accountability, and develops some of the finest leaders in the world. And all of this is relevant to somebody who's interested in pursuing a career in manufacturing or anywhere else for that matter. So that I think the best thing the employers can do is just recognize what a gold mine you have in this talent pool. And when you hire veterans, the vast majority of them thrive. In fact, I was looking at a recent LinkedIn study that said that veterans are on average promoted well ahead of their non-veteran cohort. Median household income for veterans is this is Pew. This next statistic I'm gonna give you is 17% higher than their non-veteran cohort. Again and again, they're kind of demonstrating that they can make a good transition, that they can add a lot of value. And so putting them into roles, loading them up with responsibility, and putting them in roles where they can have the biggest impact, that's not only going to be good for that veteran and their families, but it's going to be great for the organizations they serve, right? Because if they're making a bigger impact, that's going to be better for the bottom line for those companies.
So as you know, Mr. Secretary, I'm a numbers guy. I will tell you that statement that you made at the outset of that response, where you said that only 29% of high school students will meet all the standards for military service. It's literally easier to enroll in a college or university by a significant margin than it is to serve in the military. That says just a ton about the quality of men and women that are entering military service. I'm going to tell you that statistic is going to sit with me for a long, long time. Assistant Secretary John Lowry of the United States Department of Labor is our guest today on the Tech Ed podcast. And I know our audience loves specific stories. They love success stories. Is there a specific story or two about a specific veteran that has successfully made the transition into civilian life that you'd like to highlight for us this morning, Mr. Secretary?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so many of them, but I'll pick one who's a mutual friend of ours. so you'll be able to relate to this. A Navy veteran, right? And our mutual friend, Bill Berrien. I think he provides an excellent example of sort of military skills and military thinking in action to great success in the in the private sector. Bill, as you know, leads Pindle Global Precision, which is a Southeast Wisconsin-based manufacturing company. And when the COVID-19 pandemic reached America's shores earlier this year, Bill quickly realized, just from reading the news and being aware of what was going on in the world, that ventilators were in short supply. And so he could foresee the need for these ventilator OEMs, which he's not. But he knew that the ventilator OEMs would likely be ramping up their production, right? And so what he did, his company makes precision parts, components. What he did is basically took the initiative, did a quick Google search to figure out, okay, who are the ventilator OEMs? He reached out to each one of the CEOs and said, hey, look, I imagine that you're going to be ramping up production here. Don't let your supply chain, don't let the supply of components slow you down. My company is here to support your volume increases. And he and his team figured out how we're going to retool and reprogram, our machines to be able to make these parts, but they're doing it now. They're supplying ventilator manufacturers. So not only are they playing a critical war in combating COVID, but they've also positioned themselves for continued success in the marketplace. And this, to me, is just a great example of military skills and military initiative in action. Bill and his team, they assessed the changing landscape, they developed a battle plan, and then they executed the plan, which is another skill set that you learn in the military. It's not just about planning, it's all about execution. How do you adjust and problem solve on the fly to deliver that end state that you're chasing? These aren't things that Bill learned in school. These are things that Bill learned in his military experience.
Former Navy SEAL Bill Berrien, who, by the way, I would not know as well as I do if not for Mr. Secretary John Lowry. So thank you for that introduction years ago. I'll also note that I think our producer, Melissa Martin, will attest to the effectiveness of Pindle Global Precision. She has a very close friend that actually works there along with Bill. So that makes a small world even smaller, but certainly a great American and a tremendous individual. And so that your story there about his continued service to our country as the head of a manufacturing company is just a great way to start to round out our time together. I do want to share another quick story about an interesting day with our audience as we wind down here. This goes back about 2 years, and I was driving to work and I missed a voicemail, and I listened to the voicemail a little while later. And it was a gentleman introducing himself as an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and asking me to return his phone call. I knew right away that day that my day was either going to get really interesting or really bad.
Right.
And as it turned out, it was the FBI performing a background check on my friend John Lowry. He was one of the individuals being considered for nomination as the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor, doing so much great work for our nation's veterans. I guess just a really quick question: are there any recently launched projects or upcoming projects at the Department of Labor that you'd like to share with our audience?
Just two that we haven't touched on. One we just launched, we're calling TEAMS, Transition Employment Assistance for Military Spouses. So this is curriculum and assistance that is specific for them. Heretofore, we said that military spouses could sort of tag along and sit in on the transition assistance program that we're providing to the service members. But we realized, there's some unique things about a mil spouse experience that's quite separate from the uniformed spouse. So we've fashioned this entire curriculum to them, and it's not just about their transition at the end of active service of their spouse. They go through these little micro transitions every time they get a permanent change of station. So we're really excited about that. And I think the other program I'd like to highlight is the Hire Vets Medallion Program. So this is the only federal recognized award that recognizes employers who hire, retain, and support veterans, at significantly, higher levels than other companies. This year, we're going to recognize 675 of these Hire Vets Medallion recipients for their work. And the reason I'm excited about this is not only is it, nice for the companies to receive that award, but from the transitioning service member, the veteran point of view, it's great because that medallion becomes this beacon, right? Where where veterans will know, hey, there's a company that I can go where I'll likely thrive, that understands the value of veterans and supports veterans. And we have this interactive map at veterans.gov where a service member could click on that state that he wants to go to or she wants to go to and or drill down into that town and see, hey, is there a Higher Vets Medallion recipient there? And then, directly reach out to them. So I think for the company, it's great because you get a sort of a competitive edge on the war for talent. And it's obviously facilitates the transition for the service member. So, and if you're interested in learning more on that, or any of your listeners, I would direct you to hirevets.gov, HIRE vets.gov, and it has some more information on that. And we're going to be collecting applications for the 2021 recipients starting on January 31st.
So some great things on tap for our veterans as they transition into civilian life, to our employers who make sure that they continue to serve their country and our veterans as well as themselves by hiring fantastic veterans to play a role in their companies. For the military spouses, some great things coming up and that the Department of Labor is working on. I want to go out of my way this morning to thank first Jim Wall, the Executive Director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, for being our co-sponsor this morning. So Jim, very much appreciate your participation. And most important this morning, to Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor, Mr. John Lowry, first of all, for your continued service to our country in the role that you have now, Secretary Lowry, and also for spending some time with us here this morning.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. And Jim, nice to meet you. And Melissa, thank you also for your support here. And keep up the great work. I look forward to the next time our paths cross.
As do we. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.